On this episode, a fiercely independent investigative journalist reveals never-before-heard secrets of the late George Herbert Walker Bush.
In 1968, now they're saying to Nixon, hey, take Poppy Bush as your vice president. He's going, are you kidding? I don't want to happen to what happened to Kennedy, who was a reformist who had a very conservative on most things, totally corrupt, pro-corporate guy. Lyndon Johnson was going to do the bidding of all of these corporate interests. He was like, I don't want the best friend of these entrenched interests as the guy who's going to replace me if something bad happens to me. And I think it was maybe Haldeman asked him, he said, why in the world did you take Spiro Agnew? And he replied, assassination insurance.
If you're a fan of this podcast or my weekly syndicated radio program, The Conspiracy Show, why not consider becoming a supporter? Go to patreon.com/Strange Planet. That's right, we've changed the name of our Patreon page. Patreon.com/Strange Planet. And check out our 3 support tiers: the Truth Seeker tier, the Whistleblower tier, and the Star Chamber tier. Donors can receive access to an exclusive monthly Google Hangout on air or a monthly live chat with me. You can also be eligible for a monthly draw and a chance to win Conspiracy Show and Conspiracy Unlimited merch. Patreon.com/Strange Planet. Patreon.com/Strange Planet. Your support is greatly appreciated. Welcome to your Friday. Journalist author Russ Baker is standing by to discuss the late George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, just a reminder that Christian Dicadieu from Paranormal Contractors will also drop by for his regular Friday visit. Award-winning investigative journalist Russ Baker is here to discuss his book Family of Secrets, a compelling and startling take on the Bush dynasty and the shadowy elite that has quietly steered the American Republic for the past half-century and more. Russ will reveal how this network of figures in intelligence, the military, oil, and finance enabled and in turn benefited handsomely from the Bush's perch at the highest levels of government. As Russ reveals, this deeply entrenched elite remains in power regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. Russ has written for major news organizations around the world, including the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and Esquire, and has been a contributing editor to the Columbia Journalism Review. He is the author of a best-selling work of investigative history, Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. He is founder and editor-in-chief of the groundbreaking news site whowhatwhy.org, which specializes in digging into the stories the conventional media barely touches, and in seeking answers to the question, why? Who What Why is a nonpartisan and nonprofit and receives all of its funding through public donations. Russ Baker, welcome to Conspiracy Unlimited. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's always terrific to talk to you.
Likewise. Let me first get your reaction to a couple of fairly recent events. First of all, if we're going to talk about the Bush dynasty, we have to talk about the passing of Poppy Bush, Bush 41. Your thoughts? I mean, obviously an end of an era, but what else can we say?
Well, to me, the most striking thing was the total fiction that was presented to the public as to who this man was, what he did, what he accomplished, and that has been sort of an accidental life work of mine, learning about the remarkable things that he did, none of which are acknowledged or maybe even known by these traditional corporate media people who were so excited about honoring him in great blandness, and including, quite remarkably, the former editor of Newsweek magazine who provided the eulogy. I don't remember ever seeing a journalist providing a eulogy for a politician before.
Yeah, I found the media reaction to be, well, hypocrisy is the word that comes to mind, because they were certainly not fond of Bush 41 as president. At times they were ruthless, And perhaps that was justified. But I found this fawning treatment, lionizing this man that they obviously had great disdain for. I guess the only purpose that served was to hold him up in contrast to their new enemy, which is, of course, Donald Trump.
That's exactly right. And, of course, they also have been sort of lionizing his son, Bush 43, or frankly anybody, Ronald Reagan, and of course these are the same people who I think justifiably were very concerned about nuclear war with the Soviet Union and worried about the Cold War and the kind of rampant paranoia everywhere. And then now, of course, the tables are turned, and so they're all just harping on and on about Russia, not without some basis, but it's just interesting to me how both sides are so able to go with whatever serves their interests of the moment. The Republicans, Fox News, and everything about how wonderful Russia is, and Putin, I mean, it's all hypocrisy, of course, and it goes to the heart of what's wrong with both our hyper-partisan system and also what's wrong with our media. And I hope we have some opportunity to talk about what I do and why I founded my own independent nonprofit news organization.
Absolutely. We will definitely get into that. But I wanted to circle back to Bush 41 for a moment, because there were, I think, a lot of JFK assassination researchers thinking that when or once Bush 41 passed away, that a lot of those JFK assassination documents that have been held back might be released, or that his death might bring to light some more things. People might feel free to speak now that George Bush is dead. Any substance to that argument?
Well, I don't see it yet. I mean, maybe people will come forth. I do know that people were scared. I don't know if they were scared specifically of him, but the research that we'll be talking about, the research that I did in my book, Family of Secrets, of course, gets into some pretty dark stuff, and I think there was a general basis to sort of fear him and the people that he worked with. Whether his departure, I mean, I don't know if a former president in his 80s or 90s was somebody still to fear, and I don't know if because he's now gone there's any particular logical reason to think that whatever informed that fear should be abandoned. But one of the problems with these records is that, first of all, there aren't records of most of the more nefarious things, because the agencies that do these things are all about deniability. A lot of the records that do get released are kind of cover reports that people have to file, but they know not to put certain things on paper. And so the really good stuff isn't even there. It was never created. Some of the stuff that was pretty good was good because somebody was writing a report about somebody else, not about themselves. Those things, these outfits like the CIA, Naval Intelligence, these other outfits, they know the current people there may not be covering anything up, but they know when they're reading things for release, if they see anything that looks potentially problematical, they kick it out, show it to somebody else. They go, maybe we better hold this thing back, or we better redact it.
The connection to George Bush to the JFK assassination. Now, ostensibly, he's running a Zapata oil in Texas. Didn't become the head of the CIA, and then only for a short time, I think in 1976. But people still insist that George Herbert Walker Bush was involved in the JFK assassination, that he was perhaps a field agent with the CIA. We have that famous memo, J. Edgar Hoover memo, that names a George Bush as the source of some information on Oswald. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, my book, Family of Secrets, is really all about that. It wasn't my intent. I was just trying to figure out how this kind of unexceptional family became America's first family. Out of all the presidents and all the dynasties, no family was in the White House longer than this one. And that includes the president and vice president. Really a tremendous legacy. And so I was sort of trying to figure out how they came to power and why, and who was behind there? Was there more to the story? And so that was the 5 years adventure I had trying to figure all this out. I didn't really know much about the Kennedy assassination, but the more I studied the son, I kept finding that he was being cut free from all kinds of things he had done wrong. The father had the ability to pull strings and get him covered, so I became more interested in the father. What was the father's trajectory? That had to be explained by the grandfather, Senator Prescott Bush, who was deeply involved with covert operations with Allen Dulles and with the origins of the military-industrial complex and of the Central Intelligence Agency. And once I understood that and looked at Bush 41, a guy who became CIA director for no reason, there was no good explanation of why, of all the people he was named right at the height of the most powerful inquiries into wrongdoing at the CIA in the mid-'70s, why this man was appointed to basically lead the defense and really the cover-up of what they were doing didn't make any sense. So I began digging into that and spent years, and as you said, there are these documents have been unearthed. I found more of them, and I did confirm that, cutting to the chase, that he was working in intelligence for decades before he was named outside, inexperienced CIA director, that his oil company, Zapata Offshore, was a non-money-making company funded by all kinds of interesting figures and elements tied to the establishment, the intelligence apparatus, that he traveled all over the world for business. I used his own records. They showed it was nonsensical, again, losing money. Money kept coming in. They were going to all these places where there didn't seem to be any offshore activity or even any oil drilling possibilities. Documented him meeting with figures who were intelligence figures, very close relationships, and then a relationship in the week of the Kennedy assassination in Texas with a man named Al Ulmer, one of the top CIA coup experts, was living abroad, had come back, was there that week meeting with George Herbert Walker Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush was, as I documented in Family of Secrets, turns out he was in Dallas at least the night before, and that morning he covered that up. He left, I believe, shortly after the assassination, traveled to Tyler, Texas, made a phone call to the FBI, by name, identified again in declassified FBI documents, identified himself so we know it was him, even by address, and he claimed to possibly have some information on who had shot the president. Of course, that's quite astonishing that anybody would claim that. More astonishing that that person who claimed that would go on to become president of the United States, and more astonishing still that in a media interview where he was asked about his reminiscences, they asked him rather benignly about what he remembered about the day Kennedy was shot, where was he when he had heard. He kind of blanched, claimed he couldn't remember. And so we put that all together, plus the document you mentioned, FBI document signed by J. Edgar Hoover, saying that we did a briefing on the Kennedy assassination with our colleagues in these other agencies, including Mr. George Bush of the CIA. I think the evidence is overwhelming that he was working for the CIA, that he was in Dallas at that time, that a whole bunch of key CIA very dangerous personnel were there, including Al Ulmer, that he was in contact with all of them. We know that there was a cover-up, and what I've been working on, first of all, 5 chapters in Family of Secrets lays all this out in copious detail, but for the last 10 years, since that came out, I've been working on a new book on the Kennedy assassination. I just became so fascinated by this, and also fascinated by this incredible cover-up by really the entirety of the American establishment, academia. There's practically not a professor at any major university who's able to speak openly about this. The academia, the publishing, textbooks, the media. Even though a House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded a probable conspiracy involving more than Oswald, or perhaps not Oswald, none of this is ever admitted to by even the liberal. The places like MSNBC, the darlings and liberals are still all saying it was Oswald, and that's the end of the story. The conservatives are saying it was Oswald, that's the end of the story. What is that all about? That, to me, Richard, is the most fascinating thing, that our country lives in fundamental denial about the biggest truths. I think we're unique in the world in the extent to which we bury our heads in the sand, and if you speak out on these things, it's basically you're marginalized. It's kind of a career killer.
Right. Yeah, the lack of intellectual curiosity never ceases to amaze me. particularly in the part of the mainstream medium. And then you sort of contrast that. You see this firewall around the press in North America, because if you contrast that with the coverage in the foreign press, it's quite remarkable. Now, I wanted to touch one more thing regarding Bush and the CIA, and that was the Bay of Pigs, which of course may have been sort of the ultimate nail in the coffin of JFK, and then threatening to smash the CIA to 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the wind. But this perceived betrayal at the Bay of Pigs, and then we have the curious names of some of these Navy vessels involved in that covert operation. I believe one was called Barbara, another one was called Zapata, and another one was called Houston. I mean, that can't be a coincidence.
It's very weird. One of the things I mentioned in Family of Secrets is that Bush's offshore drilling company, which didn't seem to be very successful or do a lot, was given a little tiny island off of Cuba by Howard Hughes, and Bush supposedly was running drilling operations there. If there was actually any oil, I don't know. And he was employing all these Cuban exiles there, right in a very interesting time frame, working with a oil company that supposedly had hired him, and the man who was doing it was a top former CIA operative involved in overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran in the 1950s. So, I mean, all of this stuff, Bay of Pigs, the names of those boats, very suspicious. I mean, I think he was a key figure in launching this thing. What we hear is that he and another fellow who was running a military army intelligence unit out of Dallas, that they were supposedly two key point people for this, I believe for the purpose of raising money to fund this as a sort of an off-the-books type of thing. And, of course, we know that Kennedy was sort of forced into this. This was hatched under Eisenhower, and then it finally was due to happen on Kennedy's watch near the beginning of his term. And he really, I think, would have liked to just stop it altogether, but he sort of was told this thing's already in motion. And he said, well, whatever you do, I don't want this country identified with this, so you're using Cubans to go into their own country and liberate it. And if they want to do that, okay, but, don't come to me. If you guys are managing this thing or working with them, you do it. You keep it on a deniable basis. And then, of course, the thing was badly planned. I think probably deliberately badly planned. That gets into a whole other thing about what Dulles and Richard Bissell were up to. But I think they were playing a larger game there. And then supposedly Kennedy was going to be pressed. Oh my God, this thing has failed. It's turned into a catastrophe, and we need the U.S. military to step in and start bombing and backing the invaders up. And, of course, he wasn't out of his mind. He said, are you kidding? I am not going to have the United... How's that going to work in the UN? How's that going to work in the world that the U.S. is invading and bombing a sovereign country? He said, we can't do that. There's no way. And it was a terrible idea. They must have known he'd never go along with it. But, of course, they said, this was an outrage. The Cubans all felt he had betrayed them. But it wasn't him. It was Allen Dulles and his crew.
Right. The method of assassination, you had, the executive branch decapitated in 1963, and then 9-10 years later, a very different method of assassination, a political assassination, something called Watergate. I mean, at least I don't know if you agree, but that's my sort of interpretation. That was the best and most efficient way to get rid of with Nixon was this new type of assassination. Very slick operation. A bungled burglary leads to a resignation. No muss, no fuss. What was George Bush's role in that?
Yeah, so again, one of the, I think, wonderful things about Family of Secrets is it's an authentic, you were using the term about intellectual curiosity, it was an authentic journey of investigation, no agenda, no awareness, no theory of anything. I was simply trying to figure things out. And so once I educated myself on the Kennedy assassination and that my prior thought that Lee Harvey Oswald had done it and acted alone, know that this was in fact a coup. And then I continued this thread, and I continued the thread through the Bush family, look at George H.W. Bush, and we see that he goes on to, Nixon runs for president, and then Nixon eventually is removed from office. Bush in that period is a UN ambassador. He's the chair of the Republican National Committee at the time that Nixon is removed. And I of course, writing essentially a biography of him and his son, I wanted to know what his role had been in all this. Did he defend Nixon? Did he not? And I found that, he superficially defended Nixon, but he actually was knifing him. And then he bragged that he was the one who finally told Nixon, "You're out." He actually made that claim. And you're right. I looked at that and I saw a pattern, which was that Nixon, amazingly, that this is not a partisan thing, that just had, as Kennedy had fallen afoul of this establishment, these are wealthy interests, bankers and corporate chieftains and so forth, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA mandarins. And so, I see Bush again conspiring in this thing, kind of like a Zelig figure, always showing up. And we see a number of figures in the White House essentially isolating Nixon. And people say to me, "Well, why Nixon? And how can you compare the two?" Well, it's not a partisan thing. I mean, Kennedy did not understand, as Eisenhower did, that you were not really the boss. You were working for these interests. And if you fell afoul of them, you were in trouble. And I think most presidents, I think Obama was given a lesson on that early on. Bill Clinton learned that very quickly, and they understood what they could and could not do. They had some leeway with domestic policy as long as they didn't take on big corporations. They could do certain sort of, let's say, social legislation.
Right.
And then on foreign policy, their hands were tied. And Kennedy didn't understand that or didn't care. He thought, well, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And I think it really was quite an idealistic presidency. He and his brother had a track record of interest in foreign affairs and in other countries finding their own way, not as part of the Soviet bloc or as pawns of the U.S., but basically doing their own thing, and they really liked that, and that was quite radical at the time. Richard Nixon, for all of his tremendous faults, and I must say I grew up as a kid who thought that he was really, the Antichrist, and I wouldn't defend him on a lot of things, but I think that when he became president, he couldn't wait to throw off the shackles of these same interests. And in Family of Secrets, I document extensively how Richard Nixon was controlled by these interests and actually created as a politician from the get-go. From 1946, he was drafted to be a congressman, and guess who was the person who came out and chose him?
Prescott
on behalf
Bush.
of, there you go, on behalf of financial interests that wanted to knock out a member of Congress who was trying to regulate Wall Street. They chose Richard Nixon. Prescott Bush flew out. He owned, his family and interests owned defense contractors there in Whittier, California. This is stuff that has never come out. It's not in any of the books that sell millions of copies, that are widely touted by the most celebrated, these so-called brilliant presidential historians who really cover up and fabricate history. None of this was ever in there. I found it all by piecing things together, and I was like, holy cow, Richard. This guy, the Prescott Bush, the same people, Alan Dulles as a corporate lawyer, all these people working together, trying to make sure that Wall Street was not going to be able to regulate them, wanted to get rid of a congressman in California, chose Richard Nixon, and basically they owned him, and they owned Nixon all the way through. They said, now you're going to run for U.S. Senate, now you're going to be vice president to Ike. They told Ike, you're going to take this guy who we didn't want to take. And Nixon basically played ball with all of these interests. He was a very calculating person, to be sure. I don't think very strong on the ethics, but in any case, when he finally was able to run for president, he was looking forward to being his own man, and he used to hint, he would tell the public, I'm fighting against the Eastern establishment. People didn't know who he was talking about, and they thought he was talking about liberals and the usual bogeymen. But he was really talking about these corporate and financial powers,
right,
which were the same ones who had had their claws in him.
Right,
and
the Boston Blue Bloods.
Yeah, exactly, and the Wall Street people and the corporate boards and in Family of Secrets, I actually find all these wonderful things from his few loyalists, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and so on, in their diaries, where Nixon would lecture them. Don't trust these people. These corporations are treacherous. They'll destroy you. You have to protect yourself. And he'd say things like the sugar interests are the worst. Well, where were the sugar interests? They were American corporations that had dominated Cuba, prior to Castro coming in. So he was warning about all these different interests. The oil industry didn't like what he was doing on oil imports. They wanted tariffs, protectionism. He didn't want it. They wanted the oil depletion allowance, one of the most lucrative instruments they had.
That's what got JFK killed, perhaps, also, the oil depletion allowance. He tried to mess around with that, too. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, people say, well, what was the thing that got this guy knocked out? Nixon, Kennedy, Jimmy Carter is another one that fell afoul of these things. My answer is it isn't one thing. I mean, whoever you are, you've got your bone to pick with that person, but, enough of you get together at the country club and you agree that whatever, your ox is that got gored, you say, yeah, time for this guy to go. And so getting back to your question, George H.W. Bush shows up as the UN ambassador, and he's already trying to insinuate himself into the cabinet in order to do mischief to Nixon. And then we see various people, George H.W. Bush and his son, his grandfather, his father, they were all in Skull and Bones, this Yale fraternal organization that had all these intelligence people in there, and you see that they're beginning to do things to Nixon. Bush's buddy, the Skull and Bones buddy, is writing Nixon's speeches and writing speeches where he's getting Nixon in trouble. He's getting Nixon to say things he shouldn't say. John Dean, who Richard Nixon never heard of, was installed in the White House. Nixon's told, here's your new counsel. John Dean's brother-in-law was tied in with the CIA. John Dean, as far as I could tell, was working for the CIA and helping put Nixon in an untenable position when it was agreed by the Joint Chiefs and the CIA and others that Nixon was not controllable. He was going to China secretly. They weren't okay with that. He was doing the SALT, missile treaties with the Russians that they hadn't signed off on. That Kennedy, same kind of pattern, very, very similar between these two men who, sort of poetically had run against each other in 1960, and they both ended up playing with fire. And so you see Bush at every turn. They're setting Nixon up, and you see Bush's buddy E. Howard Hunt, and they're buddies from the days when he was helping fund this Operation 40, this thing that was a precursor to Bay of Pigs. You see this team at Watergate, a bunch of the same folks, Cubans. Why were they chosen? And what I discovered, and you never hear this in the mainstream media and academia, textbooks, was that the Watergate was not something that Nixon was privy to. He didn't know about it in advance. He wasn't aware. And when he first read about it in the newspaper, he said, well, what the heck is that? He didn't know that it was going to be tied back to him, but he said, well, this is ridiculous. Why were they doing that? And then when he read the details of what they were caught with, he said, it almost looks like these guys were trying to get caught. And that is exactly what that was. That was an operation to get caught with keys in their pockets that took you back to a room in the Watergate Hotel, that took you to briefcases with sequential bills that were traceable back to the committee to reelect the president, all of this. And by the way, Richard, before Watergate, there was another thing I discovered where they were trying to tie Nixon up to some scandal, and that thing failed. And this was the second or the third effort, as you put it, to nonviolently basically assassinate and remove a president.
Russ Baker is here, the author of Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. To what extent was George Bush Sr. foisted upon Ronald Reagan on that ticket?
Yeah, well, first of all, they tried to foist him on Richard Nixon. And in 1968, there's George Bush. I mean, he was elected in, 66, I think it was when he won his House seat. So here's 1968. What has he had? One term? I think he's had one term in the House of Representatives. And I discover all this correspondence, and all these corporate chieftains are writing to Nixon saying, hey, Dick, I'm a big donor and so on. Why don't you take young, promising Congressman George H.W. Bush and make him your running mate? And he didn't do it. And, the Bushes were furious at Nixon about this. Prescott, you see this picture in my book, Family of Secrets, where Prescott Bush is towering over Nixon and putting a cowboy hat on his head, and Nixon is looking embarrassed, intimidated by this Prescott Bush, who's his boss, basically. And so Prescott is like, I created you, now I want you to put my son on your ticket. Well, Nixon, who'd been brought to Dallas on November 21, and was there the morning that Kennedy was shot, I believe, was set up again, didn't know that was going to happen, and they were teaching him a lesson about what happens when you don't follow instructions. They knew Nixon was going to run for president again. And so in 1968, now they're saying to Nixon, hey, take Poppy Bush as your vice president. And he's going, are you kidding? I don't want to happen to what happened to Kennedy, who was a reformist who had a very conservative on most things, totally corrupt, pro-corporate guy. Lyndon Johnson was going to do the bidding of all of these corporate interests. He was like, hey, I don't want the best friend of these entrenched interests as the guy who's going to replace me if something bad happens to me. And so he took the worst possible person he could, a kind of a poison pill, Spiro Agnew. And I think it was, I can't remember, it was maybe Haldeman asked him, he said, why in the world did you take Spiro Agnew? And he replied, assassination insurance. And, maybe they chuckled, but he wasn't kidding. And he didn't want H.W. Bush because he knew that H.W. Bush wanted to be in his shoes.
Right.
And so that's what they did. They angered the Bushes with that, and he gave him this sop instead. He said, you can be UN ambassador. And by the way, at first when he proposed as maybe making him envoy, some kind of a secret envoy to China, Kissinger said, forget it, he's a complete idiot, and then Nixon was like, yeah, I thought of that, yeah. So, they had to give the kid a job. He was like Sonny Corleone or whatever, they had to give him the job unless they piss off the old man. So that was the background there. Now, flash forward to your question. Sorry, my answer.
No, that's brilliant. It's all good. It's all good stuff.
But now we go to Ronald Reagan, and now here's Poppy Bush. He's a young kid in '68. He already wants to be vice president. He's chafing, And now we flash forward to 1976. He wants to run for president, possibly against Gerald Ford. So instead, they give him the CIA directorship, which they pressured him. They said, you got to save the CIA. You're secretly a CIA guy. You're a CIA family guy. Get in there and save the agency from the Frank Church Committee, which he did. He wasn't able to run in '76. Ford ran for re-election, lost to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter gets in, immediately starts picking up what Frank Church is doing and trying to investigate the CIA, and he's kept to one term. That's a whole other story, which I tell part of in Family of Secrets, how Jimmy Carter was pushed out because he wasn't playing ball. And then 1980, there's Poppy Bush, and he runs for president for the Republican nomination. He runs against Reagan, and it really was a fairly vicious contest. And you probably remember that famous thing where he's trying to sort of decide who gets to speak at this debate, and Ronald Reagan famously says, "Hey, I want this guy to speak. I'm paying for this microphone."
That's right.
A brilliant moment, because Ronald Reagan was just so good, who's so good as an actor, as an MC. And so Ronald Reagan beats Bush. Bush was not a good candidate. He ran twice for U.S. Senate in Texas. He lost. He didn't have the personality. He was too uptight. He was trying to talk about I eat what was it, chitlins, pork rinds.
Right. I remember.
He was always trying to be the cool guy.
Well, yeah, he did not have the common touch, to say the least. I remember during his re-election a bit in '88, and he tried to show that he was a man of the people, just a common man. And they took a camera with him to Kmart where he attempted to buy some socks. And as he was going through the cash register, it's like he'd never actually touched money before because he's above that. He had no idea what to do with the socks. He's looking around. How do I do this? How do I proceed with this transaction? It was so awkward.
That's absolutely right. He always struggled with that, and he knew he could never loosen up and really be a good candidate. And so, in any case, he runs against Reagan. Reagan is, he's always up against. He was worried about Gary Hart, who is, again, a very charismatic person. And some other time, because we don't have time here, I looked into the Gary Hart thing, what happened to Gary Hart with his scandal, and I concluded that Gary Hart was set up on that thing with Donna Rice by ... one of Poppy Bush's people. This is what they do. It's a character assassination again and again. Jimmy Carter, all these people, and now Reagan beats him. And then what happens? Somehow, we don't know how, just as Kennedy shocked his brother supposedly by taking Lyndon Johnson as running mate, who was his enemy and his competitor in the election. Reagan takes Poppy Bush to run with him. And he takes James Baker, Poppy Bush's losing campaign manager, and makes him his campaign manager. It's the strangest thing. It's never been explained properly. But in any case, they take the Bushes on, they run, they win, beat Carter, and then they take office, and now Poppy Bush has to wait and cool his heels 8 years to become president again. So now you're going to talk about a couple of decades of just, pining for that position, which is, of course, vice president had no real power. But then suddenly Ronald Reagan is gunned down, and he is he's in really bad shape, and he might have died. He didn't. He might have died. And then we get to this amazing story, so amazing I couldn't even put it into Family of Secrets. I admit that, my publisher was like, oh my God, your book, the Kennedy stuff is so explosive. They were like scared of it. Oh. And then I put in the Watergate stuff, and they were like, oh my God, can you take this? My publisher, and I like him, but he was scared, and he said, can you take that stuff out? I said, are you kidding? That's the best stuff in the book.
Does this have to do with Hinckley and the Bush family?
Yeah, it has to do with the Hinckley, and we just didn't put it in. And I have to say, if you go to our website of the news organization I founded, whowhatwhy.org, Who What Why, we did write about Hinckley on the website, and this is this remarkable story that the man who shot Ronald Reagan, the man who, had he been successful, would have made George H.W. Bush president, wouldn't have had to wait 8 years, was from the Hinckley family. The Hinckley family from what do you call it? Not Odessa, Midland, Texas, where the Bushes lived. Poppy lived, and they had the same lawyer, and they were friends, and they were big. The Hinckleys were big donors to the Bush campaigns, and they knew each other extremely well. In fact, they knew each other so well that the night or the next night after Hinckley shot Reagan, his brother was scheduled to come over for dinner at Neil Bush's house.
Right. I remember that. Absolutely. I mean, come on. You can't make that stuff up. You can't. It's like a Hollywood script.
Well, one of the things I learned about Poppy Bush, and this is quite brilliant, was that he created this thing where you would, I think he learned this when he was young, because he was in intelligence work since he was, 19 or something. I mean, as a naval pilot doing aerial reconnaissance and photography, he filed some sort of report. He wrote something up, and he was called on the carpet, and they were like, never write anything down, and you need deniability for everything. So I think he just was so shocked by that he decided, during the Iran-Contra, he was clearly one of the main people doing this highly illegal and undemocratic thing, but he would, he'd maybe go to the meetings, but then he would not say a word, because if somebody was taking notes, he didn't want anybody to say that he was there or had said anything. And so this was his MO, but he also discovered that if you were so close to the scene of something and very sort of almost like open to it, that would become a kind of deniability. In other words, yeah, you were in Dallas, therefore you couldn't possibly been involved with this thing, and there's there's that FBI record saying that you were calling to report who might have shot the president. Why would you do that if you were involved? You wouldn't do that. Why would you possibly, if you were the one who was the beneficiary of somebody killing Reagan, you would want to have nothing to do with the shooter, because if there was this weird coincidence that your friend's son killed the president, everybody'd go, this is too freaking weird. Why would you do that? You would never do that, right? You would never have your family's son's friend involved in something like this, so you would immediately conclude that you therefore, ergo, had nothing to do with it. And that day, there was a UPI, I want to say Wire story about the coincidence and the Hinckleys, and NBC, I want to say John Chancellor maybe, had the story about the tie to the Hinckley family, and when they reran that broadcast, it was gone. It was gone, and it was completely wiped off the face of the earth. And to this day, again, the manufactured consent set, the historians, the media, and so on, this thing has vanished, totally gone.
Now, I think what I'd like to do, with your permission, is somewhere down the road do a part 2 and maybe even a part 3, because there's the family tree here. There's Prescott Bush and the Trading with the Enemy Act, and there's George 43. But I just wanted to finish up a couple of more points with Poppy Bush, and then ask you about whowhatwhy.org. But let's move into the White House with George Herbert Walker Bush, and.
Excuse me.
No worries.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Some water went down the wrong way.
The Gulf War and his involvement, perhaps business dealings with Saddam Hussein, the idea that maybe this was a vendetta against Hussein. I had read that Hussein was basically acting as a shakedown man that was his role in their partnership. He would shake down some of these rich emirs and so forth, and made himself and George Bush very rich in the bargain. Did you find anything about that? Any truth to that?
I don't know anything about that. I do know that Saddam Hussein was basically installed by the CIA, that there was essentially a coup, and he was their young military officer who was going to do what they wanted. This is the same pattern that you see with over in Panama.
Yeah, Noriega.
With Noriega. A lot of these guys were supposed to do the bidding for them, and then they got too big for their britches. They were never troubled by the human rights violations or those kind of things, but when they went independent, the way Gaddafi went independent, there's a target painted on their back, and I'd be interested to find out more about what you know or what you're saying about that. And again, I have to say, I don't know that he did anything of the kind, but there is that pattern. I think clearly they were looking to remove him for a variety of reasons. Never made clear, by the way, and this is so interesting. Why did they remove Saddam Hussein? Why did they go after the Assad in Syria? Why did they go after Gaddafi when they did? Why did they go after Noriega after having no problem with these people for years? They would just suddenly create this kind of information campaign, propaganda campaign around something. And on our website, Who, What, Why, we were almost alone among media in questioning the effort to remove Gaddafi, and we investigated. We found that it was all sort of trumped up. I'm not defending these people. Of course, they were tyrants, and of course, they had secret police and they had people killed. But our point was they had no beef with these people for a long time until they started, expressing their independence. Same pattern we've been talking about through this whole call. And then the media, including the liberal media, the so-called humanitarian, truth-telling media, were only too willing to swallow these phony stories that were just really kind of made up. and the public was all worked up, and then they said all these terrible things are happening. They're doing this, they're doing that.
The Kuwaiti children left to die. Yeah, the Kuwaiti children left to die.
Every one of these involved blatant lies. With Gaddafi, it was that he was suddenly there was this uprising for no reason, and then he was suppressing it, and people were being killed. I'm not saying there was none of that, but if you look at the uprising itself, it clearly was engineered by outside interests. It was and I don't care what country it is. You think the U.S. power establishment, if people started to take guns and going in the streets, they're going to just say, well, what can you do? I mean, you clamp down.
Right.
And he did clamp down, but that whole thing, if you read Who, What, Why, that clearly looks to have been engineered by outside surrogates for the U.S. and its allies.
Right. I mean, I remember. Well, there was also the incident with she was the ambassador to Kuwait, April Glasby, and she was asked, I believe, by Hussein, would you have any objection to Iraq invading Kuwait, because Kuwait was ripping off Iraqi oil, and Glasby said, we have no interest. So she was inviting him to invade Kuwait.
Absolutely, and you know something? I mean, you could even say, April Glasby would never have done that without checking with Poppy in the White House, number one. Number two, they would never tell somebody it was okay to invade unless, they said, well, we don't have a position on it, but that basically means we want you to invade. Now, since Kuwait was such a steadfast business partner and ally of the United States, on what basis would they want him to invade their friend? I mean, they wouldn't, which means then you have to ask the question, why was he wanting to invade? He was wanting to invade because Kuwait was slant drilling and stealing his oil. Why was Kuwait slant drilling and stealing his oil? You could argue that they were told to do that as a means of getting Hussein to attack them, because they wanted a casus belli so they could go in and remove him.
There you go. Tell me about whowhatwhy.org.
Sure. So I started whowhatwhy.org as a result of working on my book, Family of Secrets, and discovering, oh my God, there is a whole reality. And I'm a pretty sober guy. I'm a classic investigative journalist. I don't do anything or come to any conclusion until I begin digging in and interviewing and finding document trails. And so I just became frustrated with the idea that journalism was no better than any of these other institutions, which was they couldn't talk about the bigger things. They couldn't really tell us what was going on. And I said, if I'm going to be a journalist, I got to be I got to do the right thing here. I got to create a home for honest information, people who want to read honest information, people who want to generate honest information, and that's why I started Who, What, Why, and I said I'm going to make this a nonprofit organization so that no commercial interests, no financial interests can control this, no investors or owners, and we're not even going to accept any advertising, keep it totally clean, raise all of our money from donations, and also rely on some extent on volunteers, and that's our model. We've been doing it now for a number of years. We are growing, and we're very excited about what we're doing. We think is a bright future. We're looking forward to becoming one of the major sources of news in the United States and the world. We've got all the usual platforms. We're on Twitter at Who, What, Why. We're on Facebook, Who, What, Why. We welcome people to come and volunteer, donate, support our work, get involved, send us story ideas. If you're an investigator, a freelancer, you want to work with us, please contact us through the site. We are here to serve the public.
Well, desperately needed, obviously, because right now the state of journalism is in, or just the dissemination of information and the control. We are in, talk about a national crisis. There's one for you.
Absolutely, and the problem is, and I want to say that I think a lot of these news organizations also do good work. It's just that it's very limited. It's very, very limited what they feel they can tackle. So they may, it's not necessarily fake news what they're telling you. It's just that it's skin deep, and the bigger story never gets told.
All right, would you be good down the road to do a part 2 and part 3 on the Bush family secrets?
I enjoyed talking with you. I'd be happy to do it. And again, the actual correct title of the book is Family of Secrets. It's about the Bush. It's about American history. It's about what we've never been told about how power works in this country.
Russ, great talking with you. Thank you so much for spending some time with me.
Thank you, Richard. Always a pleasure.
Now, we'll reconnect with Russ down the road soon, I'm sure, and continue this conversation. We still need to talk about George Bush 41's old man, Prescott Bush, and how he helped finance Hitler, and of course, George W. Lots to discuss. Before I dim the lights in my little studio beneath the stairs, I'm going to tell you what's in store for the next installment of Conspiracy Unlimited.